Showtime.
People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off.
Turn it off.
Hey folks, welcome to a special episode of The Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. On this episode, I am talking with Heidi Honeycutt. Heidi and I have been kind of circling each other for years and years, have talked occasionally, but I've never actually sat down and had a really nice conversation with her like I do about her new book, I Spit On Your Celluloid. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did talking with Heidi. To find out more about her, please visit HeidiHoneycutt.com. Enjoy this interview. Heidi Honeycutt, for those people not familiar with you, can you give a little background and tell people why we are even talking today?
I am a journalist, mainly a film journalist, and by that I mean person who wrote about horror movies for a long time, which is technically a journalist. And there's a lot of people out there that do that, so I know that they're listening to this and thinking, oh yeah, that's what I do, but a lot of people are thinking, I have no idea what that is. And so what that means is you write about movies, but you mainly write about genre movies and mainly for websites and magazines that talk about genre films like sci-fi, fantasy, horror, Fangoria, Famous Monsters, Dread Central. Like these are the kinds of sites I'm talking about. And I'm also a huge horror fan. So that's how I started writing about horror movies, is just by being a fan. And over the years, I just kept doing it. And now it's become who I am. Not sure if that's good or bad, but it's what it is. And I'm here today to discuss my book titled I Spit On Your Celluloid, The History of Women Directing Horror Movies. It is a book I've been working on for a very long time. And I want to say 20 years of research, 15 years of writing. I'll qualify that by saying not 15 years of writing straight, because that would be pretty sad. And you would expect the book to be a lot longer than it is. But 15 years with on and off working on this particular project and fine-tuning it and getting it to a place where it was publishable and relevant. This is the end of a long journey for me with that particular book, and I'm very happy that it's at this point that it is.
What was the inspiration for the book? Where did that come from?
The inspiration for the book comes from a couple different places. As I said, I'm a horror fan person, and I started, many people, I think, in what we call the horror community, found home in the world of other people that like horror movies. Conventions, watching movies, joining clubs, going to theaters that show special screenings. And a lot of it is super accessible in a way that other genres of film are not. If you're a fan of, let's say, if you were a Wes Craven fan, the chances that you could meet him at a convention and ask him a question about one of his movies was pretty likely. You could make that happen if you wanted. But if your favorite genre is romantic comedies, you're probably never going to get to talk to Julia Roberts. It's unlikely that Richard Gere is going to come to a local art house theater for a retrospective screening of Pretty Woman. But with horror, the fans are often the filmmakers, and the filmmakers are often also fans, and it melts together in a way that people get to meet people they idolize, are inspired by, and vice versa. They get to meet people they are inspired by, and it's a very cohesive, beautiful thing when artists and their fans can connect on a really intimate level. And that's one of the only places I've ever found that to be true. It overlaps into film festivals have some of that, and some other conventions have that, and some other independent film movements have that. And they overlap a little bit, but at the core of it, it's always people who are making the darker, more subversive stuff, whether it's mainstream studio or underground. It all falls into the same category. And I was one of these people that found myself in this world meeting other like-minded people, and I loved it. And I still love it. I started meeting a lot of filmmakers. I started going to a lot of conventions, and I would meet a lot of horror filmmakers and actors that I idolized and looked up to. And one thing that I noticed that was odd, and this isn't necessarily true anymore, but it was in 2005, that you could go to a huge horror convention and you would be able to meet women, but they were all actresses. And there's nothing wrong with that. I idolize a lot of actresses. I have a lot of favorite horror movie actresses whose autographs I've been excited to get. But I noticed that all the men were not actors. A lot of the men were also the filmmakers. And so you could meet Dario Argento. You could also meet Bruce Campbell. You could meet Elvira, but you couldn't meet Mary Lambert or some of these other women who had directed movies that were on the same level as the men who were guests. And I thought that was odd. And I assumed it was because it just wasn't their scene. Maybe what's fun to a man is not the same thing that's fun to a woman. I don't know. I didn't really know what to make of it until I started asking around. And I started asking tell me your top 5 horror movies directed by a woman. And we're not talking about like random people on the street. We're talking about like hardcore horror fans at a convention. There are a couple that they would always immediately, Mary Lambert and Pet Sematary. Oh, I love American Psycho by Mary Harron. Oh my God, I love Slumber Party Massacre by Amy Holden Jones. And then if the person was really hardcore into it, they might, have you seen Ravenous by Antonia Bird? It's great. And then you might get, weren't all the Slumber Party Massacres directed by women? And so you stall out on number 5. People couldn't really go past that. And I thought, there just must not be that many. What are there, maybe 10? So I started looking into it. And there were 10, and then there were 20, and then I found out there were 30 and 40 and 100. And a lot of them are not famous. A lot of them are not well-known. A lot of them are not that good. But they exist. And I was surprised at how many exist and how few of them were given the same level of fandom as, let's say, a cheesy 80s horror movie by a man. So there's some really bad or fun or silly or gory movies that we can all agree maybe don't deserve an Academy Award, but they have a fandom behind them and people are still interested in and enjoy watching them. And a lot of movies like that made by women. I didn't understand it. So I thought it was really interesting. And the more I delved and the more I looked and the more I did research, the more films I found from other countries, the more films I found that were, at first I was looking at shorts and features, and then I gave that up really quick when I realized there are thousands and thousands of shorts directed by women in the horror genre. But there are also thousands and thousands of horror features directed by women. And it took a long time for me to really figure out that definitive list. And at one point it was only 1,000, and now I believe it's up to 3,000. And the kicker is, as time goes on, more and more women are directing more and more things. And so this list gets longer and longer. Every month I'm adding to it. Whereas in 2005, I was adding 10 films every couple months. Now I'm adding like 10 films every week that pop up. And I'm like, wow, okay, another one. And this festival releases their lineup, or I hear from a filmmaker that they're making a new one. It's absolutely impossible to keep track of now because there's so many. But it's the films in the past are really the most interesting because they're the ones that have been written about the least. And they really are an important part of the horror genre. And they deserve to be known about and discussed so that we can finally just dispel the myth that women never directed any horror movies. Because I think it's a myth. And that's a big part of what this book is about. It's the story of some of these films and the women who made them and how they got made and why.
I am always impressed by somebody who does a ton of research, and I can tell that you did a ton of research with this book, especially the nascent days of cinema. You're going all the way back. Still, there are so many unknown films that are out there that we don't know about right now, but then for you to dive deep and be like, all right, what are all of those films that we know about that were directed by women? And then to go one step further and look at genre films.
Yeah. A lot of film history in general is lost. It's not just women's films. Many men's films are lost to time due to bad preservation of film, lost records, especially in the silent era. Especially in the silent era, we have so many things that were just not considered important that we would consider important now. But at the time, it's like, when we do it, let's just throw this out. It's done. Recycle. They didn't recycle back then, but or I don't think they did. Anyway, there are a lot of films that have been lost to time and that don't exist, or that they exist in pieces, and you can only find out about them by piecing together the puzzle pieces. And that might mean going through old moving pictures magazines, specific countries' Cinematheque records, because a lot of countries will keep records of the films from their country, even if they're not complete. But it's not all gathered in one area. And there are so many films that are lost, and this is just one way to put that information together about one type of film that was lost over time. So I'm hoping that it gives some of these films a little more of story that we can follow, a little more of what was this film about? Who was in it? What was the person doing that made them in a position to make this film? And sometimes you can't find that information, but sometimes you can. And it is difficult. That is the most difficult part of the book, because all those people are dead, by the way. So if somebody was alive in 1911, they're not alive now. And you can try to find relatives, but mostly that information's just gone. Once you hit like the 1960s, it's a lot easier to do this research just because of records and because of a lot of the people who are still alive. I was really lucky to be able to talk to Roger Corman a lot, and his wife, Julie, was really helpful as well, getting the records straight on a lot of stuff that I write about their films. And he just died, and that's so sad. And I'm so grateful that I was able to run it by him so that I could find out what was wrong and have them give me the right information. But I couldn't do that with a lot of the older films. A lot of them are just, this is what I think, this is what I got, and I hope it's right.
How open were cinemas in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s to having women directors? Was it strictly a boys' club? I know there are always exceptions to the rule, like an Ida Lupina, but did women have to assumed names if they were going to direct something?
That's a two-part question. So I'll answer the second part first, which is women were using pseudonyms even up until the 1970s because it was often just easier to get the movie made if people thought a man was making it, especially with independent films. If you have a studio behind you, it's a lot easier to get what you need for the film. But there are cases of independent films in the 60s and 70s where the woman was like, just put the cinematographer down as the director. And that way, when we go to rent the lights or the gear or the whatever, nobody's going to give me a hard time. So there are cases of women doing that. And in the past, the role of director was not really well defined until the Hollywood studio system really took off in around 1915, 1920. And that was when feature-length films finally really became a thing. Before that, films were all 1 reels, 2 reels, sometimes 3 reels. It was short. You would go and you would watch a really short film. All films were shorts, technically, up until then. And so you could make so many of them, and people wouldn't put that much thought into it. It was more like scenarios rather than complete full stories beginning to end. You might be shooting a scene of something, or there's the train robbery, but you don't know who the characters are. You don't know why they're doing it. You get some Méliès stuff that has more of a cohesive narrative, but it's very short. So back when that was the case, and these theaters were really just places where people would set up a screen and put some chairs down and charge tickets, it wasn't that important of a job. It wasn't really considered important if you were the writer versus the director versus the producer. And often you were all three things, like the way that many low-budget filmmakers are today. If you want to direct a low-budget film in your living room, chances are you're also producing and you wrote it, and so are some of the actors and maybe your parents. So back then it was a little more fluid like that. So nobody thought this is the director job and it's very important. And it wasn't extremely well paid. It wasn't until Hollywood movies started really making a lot of money and the studios built their own theaters. So that's something people might not know, which is in the United States, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, the studios owned their own theaters. So they would show their own films in their own theaters. They wouldn't show other people's films. Maybe once in a while, they might make an agreement with another studio. If it was a really lucrative film, they might do some trading back and forth. But if you were an independent filmmaker and you made a film, you were not going to be able to show it, except in your living room. And once that situation came about, the role of director became a really high-paying, prominent role in Hollywood studios. And that was the point where men wanted these jobs. And so men got these jobs. You have to remember also, women couldn't vote in the United States until 1920, which doesn't really have anything to do with filmmaking, but it says a lot about the amount of individual political power that women had, which is not that much. If you went to a studio and you wanted to direct something in 1910, they may be like, sure, whatever, and they'll pay you a pittance and you got to direct something. If it's 1920 and you show up at one of these major big studios, chances are they're going to say, I'm really sorry, we could never give that role to a woman. It's a really big job. It's a feature-length film. It's got a huge budget on the line. We need an experienced man in charge. And that was a very normal, okay thing to say at the time. Obviously, a woman didn't like it. But I'll be honest, I was a child in the 1980s, and I was told women can't be president by teachers. And it wasn't like women suck and aren't good enough. It was just like, women can't be president. And why not? It's just, women just aren't president. It's not that, they just aren't. Men are president. Oh, okay. I guess that's just a job for men. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I was like, hey, wait a minute. And it actually became, by the time I was an adult, it was something that was a little different. People were actually talking about maybe having a woman president. But there are some things that just seem normal and you don't question them. And that was one of them. And so women were relegated to making independent films or being extremely lucky and being able to direct less prominent projects for studios. Usually they were about other women. Usually they were issues that men had zero interest in, like abortion or divorce. These social issue films, which are really just exploitation films masquerading as social issue films. But anything like that, anything with rape or babies or whatever, it was considered a woman's film. And so it was okay to give women like Dorothy Arzner those kinds of films. And she was one of the few women directing studio films in the 30s and 40s. There were only like 2 or 3. And that's just the way it was. Women were pushed out of directing, not by any one individual man. There wasn't like a Kabbalistic meeting where all these men got together and decided that we can't have women doing this. But it was just a normal societal thing that it wasn't appropriate for women to be ordering grown men around in any kind of job. And that's a lot of what directing is. Women still wrote a little bit. Really famous women like Frances Marion were able to continue writing scripts and stuff. There were a couple really big, famous playwrights like Dorothy Luce in the 20s and 30s who they were hired to write scripts. But yeah, there were just no women around until around the 1950s. And this is true for other countries too. This is not just the United States. It's pretty much the same story in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Australia, in Canada, in Italy, in Mexico. And these were the other countries that had a blossoming of the film industry as well before the First World War.
So did the collapse of the vertical monopolies, did that help out women filmmakers?
Absolutely. The loss of the monopoly on theaters helped a lot of filmmakers, not just women, gain access to this industry that they'd been shut out of before. Really, you have people like Maya Deren, who was a filmmaker, but she was, or Germaine Dulac in France, she was a filmmaker. But these are people who had to show their films like in little tiny cafes on a screen. There was no other, who else is going to, nobody was buying these films. They weren't getting money for them. They were artists making art. And when the studio system collapsed, I think it's in the 50s. I want to say late 50s, when the Supreme Court decision finally decided that you cannot only show your own films in a theater, it's a monopoly. Then suddenly you start getting drive-in theaters, you start getting independent theaters, you start getting independent filmmakers like Roger Corman. People who suddenly, you're not going to spend a lot of money making films if you have nowhere to distribute them, right? You have to make your money back. But suddenly you have an avenue of distribution. And so lots of people were suddenly able to sell their films. And people jumped in on that. People wanted to make money, or people had always wanted to make films, and now they finally could, or a combination of both. And you wouldn't have had somebody like Roger Corman, or somebody like Ed Wood, who was terrible, but still, he was able to jump in and do it. And there are a lot of Robert Lippert was a producer who produced a ton of low budget and exploitation and other films for studios that were distributed in non-studio theaters and drive-ins and things like that. So the other thing that happened, and this happened particularly in the West, not so much the East, was television. So television after World War II pops up, and suddenly there is a need for lots of directors, because you have TV series now. You have made-for-TV movies. You suddenly don't just have to put out a film or two every month. You need something on that television every day. And a lot of it's live, let's say. Or a lot of it's like that play style where it's a low-budget narrative half-hour special. And a lot of men, this was not a prestigious directing job. This was like a step down for anyone who had ever directed a studio film. You weren't going to get Vincent Minnelli directing for television like that. And you couldn't afford him anyway. Like, you'd go broke paying these big directors their real directing fees. Who would do it as women? A lot of women were like, I'll do it. And a lot of men who never had an opportunity to direct anything for a studio suddenly found themselves directing. A lot of people who were probably having a lot of trouble getting into the film industry in general suddenly found that they could create TV shows. You could have The Twilight Zone. You could have I Love Lucy. You could have all these things that would not have been made in feature film form by a studio. Because suddenly you have this new distribution avenue. And the combination of those two things really opened up a lot for women. And you mentioned Ida Lupino before, and she's a great example because she was an actress, for people who don't know, a really great actress, did a lot of noir in the 40s. And then in the 50s, when she aged out of the ingenue role, she decided she wanted to direct. And it luckily was right at the time that all this was going down with the studios and the theaters. And she had to form her own independent production company with her husband. And they funded their own movies that she directed. This was not like she was not hired by MGM to direct movies. This was all her own pushing and doing. But at the end of it, they had theaters that they could put their films in. And that's what allowed Ida Lupino to become a feature film director. And same thing with television. She was desired as a television director because she had that previous film experience. She had those years of acting experience on set, which taught her a lot. And she ended up directing one of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes. She directed 6 episodes of Boris Karloff's Thriller. She directed a ton of suspense theater, television, and she kept on and off directing and acting, mostly in television, for the rest of her life, really, until she got too old to do anything. She's really the prime example of how those things affected women directors in general.
How did you go about doing your research for this? You mentioned that it took 20 years to research, 15 years to write. What are your sources? Where are you going and finding all this information?
So before anybody feels really bad for me, I just want to say that the first 5 years of research was really me learning in general. I said, starting from this place where I was asking questions at conventions. And then, because the next step was, I'm going to seek out some of these women. I'm going to find them. I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to find out, why aren't you at a convention? And so that was the next thing I did, was seeking out actual living people who could tell me the story of their lives as a director. And that is a huge chunk of this book. I'd say it's more than 50% of this book is one-on-one or very close to that interviews with people who've actually directed a horror movie who are women. And that takes a long time. And they were done in different ways. I used to run a website for all about women in horror. It's long gone. But for a couple of years, I had this website called Pretty Scary, and we focused on women. And I did a lot of interviews with short filmmakers, and I did a lot of press dates. So for things like The Punisher 2, or what was another one I covered? Oh, Blood and Chocolate by Kathy Von Garnier, which I hesitate to call a horror movie. But I had opportunities like that to meet bigger directors and interview them on a press level. But I also was seeking out women just, hey, I heard you made a film. I'd love to see it. Okay, it's a 20-minute short. Great, I'd love to see it. And then I'd love to talk to you about it. And so a lot of this input came from years of doing just that kind of stuff and gathering this information and maybe not even truly knowing exactly what to do with it once I had it. But it was lots of information gathering like that. The second half is when there's no way you can interview somebody who's been involved, when it's either they say no, they're dead, and that's happened a lot, then you have to rely on other people who worked on the film. You have to rely on what was covered by someone else. For the older stuff, I think I mentioned Moving Picture Magazine was a huge help because tons of advertisements about movie coming out, listing the plot or a review of the film or listing the date it came out and the theaters it played in. That was really helpful. A lot of the other countries do not have that. There's an Argentinian series from the 1950s that was television, and it had a woman director, and it's all horror, and it's impossible to find. It doesn't exist anymore. There's almost no records about it. That kind of stuff like that was way more difficult and took more time. And you'll notice if you read the book that those are probably the areas that are most limited in terms of the information I can give. Whereas I did do a full sit-down Mary Lambert interview where I can tell you every detail because I had that opportunity. Unfortunately, it is missing in some areas. And of course, couldn't cover every single filmmaker because like I said, there are thousands and thousands of women horror movie directors, shorts and features, and the book would never be done. So some people may read it and go, I wonder why she didn't write about that movie. And that's why, because it was like, oh my God, it has to be a book. It can't be something that never gets written. So I had to very carefully pick examples that showed where I was in the story of women directors from the beginning of film until the present, choosing films and their filmmakers that represented what was going on. I tried to do that as best I could, and unfortunately that meant leaving some stuff. But
you can't please everybody. It's over 300 pages, and it seems like it's just filled to the brim with information. And it's not like you've got a 40-page photo break in there. Though I do have to tell you that the layout of the book is gorgeous.
Oh, thank you. That's awesome. I'm a control freak in many ways, and I was really careful about which photos I wanted to put in the book, and not all of them made it in because that's an editorial choice and a layout choice, and I didn't have final control over that. But I did have a lot of control over which images were considered for the book, and so I'm very happy to get the ones in that I was able to. And I love the cover. So the cover, I'm just very pleased with it. It's exactly what I wanted it to be. There's a designer named Luke Insect, and I'd seen his work there's a book I contributed to called Warped and Faded that it was put out by the Alamo Drafthouse people. It's basically like an encyclopedia of all the films that they've showed on their Weird Wednesdays events. And I did a little article on Stephanie Rothman for them. But when I got the book as a contributor, when I got my copy, the layout and the cover design blew me away. And I was like, I want that person to do my cover. And I had to talk my editor into it. He was very nice. The editor, I have to say, put up with a lot of my shit, and I'm very happy about that. But I was very insistent. I was like, this person has to do it. And then I chose the images and told him exactly what I wanted. And it turned out, I think, pretty well. So if nothing else, it has a nice cover. So
there's so much more to it than just the cover, though.
I hope so. When you get really close to a project, and I know that filmmakers will understand what I'm saying and authors will understand what I'm saying, and you will probably understand what I'm saying because you have a podcast and you write, and when you get really close to a project and you've been working on it for a long time, it's almost, you lose perspective, and it's very hard to tell if what you're doing is good or not. And you really need input from other people at that point to really tell you if you're off base or not. And so I definitely got to that point with it several times where I can't tell if this is boring or if it's irrelevant or if my sentence structure is poor. Like, I couldn't tell anymore. So I'm just going with that it's good because I don't think the editor and publisher would have let it go. That. So I hope that it is. I hope honestly, my big wish with it is people who are film fans, who enjoy film history, who enjoy tidbits of knowledge and behind the scenes. That's who this book is for. It's not an academic study. It's not. There is politics in the book in that you can't write a book about women doing anything without some politics coming in, because it's just the nature of the 20th century. Women's politics changed art and changed many things. But it should give you a general idea about some of these films that are lesser known and some of these films that are very well known, but maybe we don't know the whole story. Maybe you've never sat down and really concentrated on how did that one movie that you've seen a bunch of times actually get made, or what the director thinks of it, or any of the mishaps that happened on set, or what was the director's favorite moment, or things like that. I'm really happy that I was able to put in, because that's the stuff I like reading about. That's my favorite stuff.
Other than people that have passed away, what were some of your biggest challenges for the book?
One of the biggest challenges is that this information is not concentrated anywhere. If you want to write a book about the Civil War of the United States, you find hundreds of books, and they all might have a different take on it. It might be like from the Confederate perspective, from the Union perspective, from Abraham Lincoln's private secretary. But there's a lot of it out there, and you can piece together whatever kind of story you want based on the research that other people have done. For this, none of this information was really gathered anywhere. And so that was really hard to put it all together. Just making that list was hard. Once I had that list, the films, and I'm sure there's still films missing from it, I'm sure, but that really helped me. Once you know what the films are, you can seek out the ones you haven't seen. And that was really hard, because this is one of the most frustrating things. This book took a long time to write, and I would get to a point where there'd be a particular film I wanted to write about, and it would be unavailable. And I would have to seek out a bootleg. And I often did. I got a lot of bootlegs because it was the only way to see some of these movies. And I would finally get the bootleg, but there'd be nothing else, and I would just be trying to figure it out. And then right as I would finish whatever I was working on, all of a sudden Criterion would be like, we're putting this movie out on the next month. And I'd be like, you're fucking kidding me. Like, I just spent 2 years researching this film and trying to find anything out about it. And this whole time, all of a sudden Criterion pops. It started happening enough that I started going a little crazy, because it happened 5-6 times. And I started thinking to myself, somebody at Criterion is spying on me, which was ridiculous, right? It was like a psychotic moment, because this didn't happen. But it was weird how that would happen. And it wouldn't be like, oh, that film that I was researching last year is now, it would be like that film that I just finished researching yesterday is going on Criterion tomorrow. It would be like that. And that was the most frustrating aspect of it, because it made me feel like I would break down and be like, I just wasted so much time researching this film. Now everybody's going to see it on Criterion. And when they read my book, they're going to be like, who the fuck cares? I've already seen this movie, and I watched all the documentary pieces about it, and it was so much better done than in this book. I definitely had those moments, and that was so hard and made me feel like, Jesus Christ. And then shit happens. You apply for a job at Criterion and you don't get it, and you're like, what the fuck? That's a whole other story. That's a whole other... I can't tell you how many women's film festivals I've applied to for programming positions or other. And it'll be like, must know about women's films, must have experience programming and writing about women's films. And I will like just get an auto reject. I'm like to the point where I'm like, I don't get it. But anyway, the lesson I learned from it is this. Time is short. You have to make your mark in a timely manner, or other people are going to take parts of your research that you've already done, and they're going to adapt it, and they're going to put something else out first. And that happened to me a couple times. It was really heartbreaking, but it's my own fault for not finishing the book as soon as it could have been finished. And the really difficult part about it is the times that I wasn't actively working on the book, it wasn't that I just didn't feel like it or whatever. I have a dedication in my book to my parents and my sister who are all dead. And they all passed away within the same 6-year period. And if that hadn't happened, the book would have been done 6 years earlier. Let me put it that way. So sometimes life will try to get in the way of whatever it is you're doing. And even if it's something as ridiculous as a book about women horror filmmakers, it's like you still have to finish it, because even if that's the only goddamn thing you do in your life, at least you did it. And you can't let anything get in the way, not even other people, I don't mean, oh, how inconvenient that they died. Other people accomplishing things that you wanted to accomplish and watching other people do it. And it can be so disheartening, but you have to do it because otherwise you won't do it at all. And that's even worse. So that's the thing I learned.
What were some of the most surprising things that you learned while you're doing your research? Did you uncover any films that just completely blew your mind?
Yeah. In particular, there's a filmmaker named Germaine Dulac, who's a French filmmaker. She made The Seashell and the Clergyman, which is a really well-known surrealist film from 1928. And that's all you ever hear about her. But she made this other film that I never heard of before called Le Diable dans la Ville, which means the devil in the town, the devil in town. And it's a medieval thriller, supernatural film from the early 30s. It has sound, and it's in French, but it's this awesome suspenseful thriller with gothic medieval elements. And I've seen entire books devoted to this woman, and I've barely heard of this film. And that's true for a lot of other earlier women filmmakers, the quote unquote pioneers, right? A lot of them had films that were definitely genre films. But when people write their books on women pioneers or they make their documentary specials, they never focus on it. They always focus on the super mainstream drama or women's interest stuff. I think they think it makes it more legitimate. They feel like focusing on someone's horror movie is going to make them seem like a less of a serious filmmaker, where to me it's the opposite. I'm suddenly interested in seeing their films. I have no interest, and no offense to anybody who wants to make a film about it, but I have no interest in your drama about, oh no, am I getting an abortion? I just don't give a shit, and I'm not going to watch it. I'm a horror fan, and I like watching scary movies, and I like cool movies and weird movies and movies that make me scared and cry and that make me laugh. And those are the movies that a lot of these early women filmmakers made that don't get talked about. That was really surprising to me. The other thing that really surprises me is how many women do not want to be considered horror filmmakers. And I think it's the same attitude. Some women are absolutely fine with it. And they're like, I'm super proud of my movie and it was such a great experience. And I'm so glad that people know it. But there are a lot of women who wanted a mainstream film directing career. And they made a horror movie or two because they're easy to distribute. And let's say it's 1980. They were easy to distribute. They had maybe some special resources or they got hired by a person for that particular project. And that's the movie that people know about. And maybe their career never really took off otherwise. Maybe they got, and now they're making other projects that are totally not related to horror at all. And they don't want to be thought of as a horror filmmaker. So to me, being thought of as a horror filmmaker is like the best thing in the world. So I'm like, I don't understand that. But some people feel that way. Some people feel that it's not really who they are. And I definitely had women who, some were happy to talk about their films anyway, but they were very adamant to tell me privately, I honestly I don't feel like that's who I am. I'll talk to you about my film, about this film. Or their film, they prefer to consider their film a thriller, even though everybody else considers it like a horror movie. I've heard, no, it's a thriller. It's a dramatic thriller. I'm like, yeah, okay, in the sense that maybe it's not supernatural, but there are a lot of horror movies that are not supernatural. Psycho is a horror movie. There's nothing supernatural going on there. I consider The Birds a horror movie. Halloween has no supernatural element. At least the first one doesn't. And yet there are other movies that are just like those in many ways. And the women, they're like, well, I got several times I don't know why you want to talk to me, but I'll talk to you. I want to talk to you because your movie, this XYZ movie that you made, that's not a horror movie, but if you want to talk, I'll talk. Okay. And then there were women who flat out wanted nothing to do with it at all. And were like, I hate that movie. It was the worst experience of my life. I never want to talk about it. Okay, I'll make you. But and then there were other women were very like, oh my God, I haven't talked about this movie in years. It's so weird that someone wants to talk about it. What do you want to know? So it's all over the place. But I was really surprised by those first couple things that you always hear people don't think of horror as legitimate. And when you're so enmeshed in horror and these big, giant film festivals that all they show is horror, or these giant Blumhouse studio movies and Sony releasing these horror movies, whatever, it feels very mainstream. It feels very legitimate. But in general, I think people still perceive it as less than, which I don't. And I think a lot of other people don't, but.
So the book comes out on August 8th. Are you doing any sort of like publicity tour or book signings, those kind of things?
Yeah, I'm introing a movie called Hollywood 90028, which is a movie I write about in the book a lot. Grindhouse Releasing just did a beautiful new 4K transfer of it, so it looks great. And they've been screening it around. So we decided that I'm going to involve that movie. I did the commentary for Grindhouse, which is great too. So I know about it, which makes sense. So I can do like an intro to the film and do a book launch. And then on August 8th itself, the actual release day, I'm going to be in Los Angeles, and I have a book launch event at the Philosophical Research Society, which is a sort of an esoteric, crazy place in Los Feliz near Hollywood. That it's like this old building that was purchased in the 1920s by crazy people who wanted to have like a spiritual, like mystical thing. And now the people that run it are awesome. And they do all these cool, crazy events. Like they do all kinds of stuff. And I'm doing a presentation followed by a panel. And I have a couple of women filmmakers that I write about in the book on the panel with me. And namely Anna Biller, who did The Love Witch, Sydney Horton, who did a short film called Meta that I write about in the book, Jill Gevargizian, who wrote and directed The Stylist, both the short version and the feature, which I write about in the book, and Tasha Halevi, who was one of the main directors on Give Me an A, which was an anthology about using horror to describe women's rights in terms of abortion and choice. These are all women that appear in the book, and their work appears in the book either a lot or a little bit. And I feel like they're really good examples of just people whose films you may not have heard of or you may not have seen, but the story of how the film got made and why is really cool. And we should be paying attention to everyone's story, men and women, of how their films got made and why and how, because it's just super interesting. So they're joining me for that. And then on August 9th, with the American Cinematheque, we're doing a screening of The Stylist, the short and feature by Jill Gevargizian with Brea Grant in person. And we're showing it because it came out during the pandemic and it's never screened in Los Angeles. And again, it's a film that I write about in the book. I have extensive interviews with Jill and with Brea about her other movie, Lucky, and other films, the 24-Hour Shift, whatever. There's a lot of different stuff that is connected between these filmmakers in the book. So we're going to talk about that, but we're also going to have several other filmmakers on the panel who are not announced yet. And then on August 10th, I have a signing at Dark Delicacies Bookstore in Burbank in Los Angeles. And I'm being joined by Stephanie Rothman, who's the director of The Velvet Vampire. Stephanie Rothman, by the way, I want to give a shout out to. So she was the first woman hired by Roger Corman to direct horror. And she has been invaluable to me as a friend, as a mentor, as an an interview subject. And she was really able to shed light on that period of time in a way that was really helpful and beautiful that I hope comes through in the book. So she's going to come and join us for the signing, along again with Anna Biller, Jill Gevorgizian, Deborah Brock, the director of Slumber Party Massacre 2, Hope Perello, the director of The Howling Sixth, and a couple more filmmakers as we confirm them. So I'm trying to get like a mix of these different directors, and they're all going to sign the book with me because they're the ones who are in the book, and they're the ones whose autograph we really want. Let's face it, like, also, it's probably cool to get the author's autograph, but like, you're not buying the book because of me, you're buying the book because people in it, and I want my book signed by them. So it's also just like a way for me to trick them all in being in the same place so I can get all their signatures. So,
Heidi, is there a good place for people to keep up with you and your work online?
I have a website that pretty much just has my book information on it right now. It's just HeidiHoneycutt.com. I'll probably be adding some stuff to it related to the book and all that. I often appear on Trailers from Hell. I've had a lot of fun with that. I think one just came out today, in fact, for Dillinger, the 1934 version. Anyway, I could be wrong about the date. But so I'm often on Trailers from Hell. I have an Instagram. Further book launch stuff, I have a lot of stuff going on in Spain and Portugal and Amsterdam throughout the fall for the book. So I'll be around. I'll be at Fantasia. I'll be at these different places, and I'll probably like post on my Instagram about it. I also do the Etheria Film Festival, which our live event is coming up. And for those who don't know, Etheria Film Festival is a showcase of the best new horror, sci-fi, fantasy short films directed by women. And that's going to air on Shudder from July 15th to August 15th. So you can see that there. And that's something I do because I love women directors. And this is a cool way for me to see their stuff. So I'm around and people can find me. I'm super easy to contact. Probably isn't a smart idea. But at the same time, it's like, who cares? So just send me an email if you want. It's fine.
Heidi, thank you so much for your time. This was great talking with you. I really appreciate this.
I really enjoyed talking about this, and I'm very grateful that you wanted to have me on the show. Yeah, so thank you, and thank you to the audience. If anybody has any questions about the book or whatever, feel free to just find me and ask me. I'm happy to talk about it. I literally do nothing else.
Spit on your until the mountain when no one can win.